For every startup, there comes a point in time where a decision must be made on whether to pivot or persevere. And this usually happens when obstacles start arising in the transition from marketing the startup's product to mainstream customers instead of just early adopters. And that is because you tend to exhaust the early adopter population of your customers. You start seeing declining growth. You start seeing product experiments not yield the results that you want. Just overall diminishing returns from extracting value out of the early adopter market that your product was initially going for. And when there are issues with that transition, you want to pivot. And that means modifying your product hypothesis in the form of modifying the value hypothesis behind your product, or the growth hypothesis, which is how you think your product will grow. In order to successfully pivot, you must first know what the issue is with your product itself. What about the assumptions that you initially made are incorrect, and what exactly needs to be done to correct those assumptions, to make a new set of assumptions that can then continue to drive growth in your product. Now, a lot of startups, they don't make this decision early enough, and as a result, they might not be dying, but they might not be growing as well. And when you're in this limbo state, which is what Eric Ries calls the land of the living dead, when your startup is neither growing nor dying, when you're just going with the motion, going with the flow, just like existing, really, that's when you want to pivot. And a lot of startups, they get intoxicated almost with revenue growth, with customer growth that isn't really what they expected. So they think, okay, since metrics are still growing, I should be continuing on this course, when in fact you want to be pivoting. You want to be accomplishing the targets that you set for your customer growth, for your revenue growth. You don't just want to be growing positively, you want to be hitting the milestones that you initially set for your startup. So now that's established, now that you know when exactly to pivot, and that is when you're facing diminishing returns with your product development efforts, when your experiments aren't yielding the changes in metrics that you want. And I'm talking about actionable metrics, not just vanity metrics, metrics that can be directly affected by product development. What can you do to pivot? What can you do to reorient your product strategy? Now, there are many ways you can pivot as a startup. One kind of pivot is to refocus on one specific feature with your product and make it the main focus of your product experience. And another kind of pivot is what's called a customer segment pivot, which is when you focus on a very specific segment of customers and you make them your group of users to focus on. Eric Ries lists out quite a few in Chapter 8, which you can definitely look into to see which ones fit your situation. And once you pivot, you want to be sure that you're actually, again, on the right course. And the way to know if you're on the right course is to see if this pivot has resulted in changes in the actionable metrics that you're currently tracking, changes that show that you are actually hitting the growth milestones that you initially set, and not just arbitrary milestones. And ideally, you want to be at a point where you're actually working towards what's called product market fit. So that's really the point of a pivot, to make sure that you're once again on the journey to product market fit and not in this limbo state where you're neither growing nor dying. The point of Chapter 8 is just to tell you when you should be pivoting as a startup and what are the telltale signs that show that you should be pivoting and what the different kinds of pivots you can explore are. So that's all for Chapter 8 summary, and I will see you for Chapter 9 summary.